and in about an hour you'll know everybody's life story. Thanks for coming.
It's a memory.
Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Top of the morning.
My name is Robert Perkins Strathern. I was born in Trenant, Scotland, March 31st, 1853. You'll have to pardon me way of speaking. No matter how hard I try to speak like an American, everybody knows I'm from Scotland. Trenant was a small town just 10 miles east of Edinburgh, within sight of the Firth of Forth. It was a coal mining town at the time, not very pretty and not very clean. My grandfather was a collier himself, but my dad swore he'd keep the family out of the coal mining business. He'd set up keeping a little store in Trenant, and that's what he was doing when he married my mother Jessie. I had neither brothers nor sisters. My father sent me to the village school when I was 6, and scarcely a year later I lost my mother. So my father couldn't look after his store and me as well, so he moved us all into his brother George's house in Trenant, where his sister Isabella, who never married, could look after me. Isabella never did marry. Still, it was a lonely life for me in Trenant while I was at the village school, except my other Aunt Marion had a daughter who was a playmate of mine. Her name was Mary Lamb. More on her later. When I was done with school, my father apprenticed me to a tea importer far away in the city of Glasgow to learn the blending of tea. Glasgow was an awful damp city then, plenty of thick smoke in the air. When I finally came home on a holiday, coughing, our family doctor said that I would surely die of the tuberculosis if I didn't leave Scotland for someplace warmer and drier. He suggested Australia. But since we already had a family on the west coast of the United States, I took ship in 1873 at the old age of 20, round the Horn of South America to San Francisco and then down the coast to Santa Barbara. My uncle in Santa Barbara got me a job cutting lumber in Carpinteria. And that's where my father found me, when he came over the next year. And when he came from Scotland, he brought over my foster mother, Isabella, and that cousin of mine, Mary Lamb. Well, my father had some money from selling up his shop and his stock in Trenant, and so he was able to buy a little farm in Carpinteria for us to work on. And one thing led to another. In 1879, I married that long-lost cousin, Mary Lamb. She's been an elegant wife to me ever since, even though she took a temperance pledge the night before the wedding. Never did get a chance to taste that marvelous Scottish whiskey that my dad brought across the water with him. Well, then we ranched up in Peru for a couple of times. You people may call it Piru, or Peru is the way to say it. And that's where most of my sons and daughters were born. But late in the 1880s, CME started to open up, and a long drought was coming to an end. Land was still cheap here, and my father and I invested in 14,000 acres and built a nice white house for my wife Mary on it. In CME, we mainly raised cattle. My kids will tell you more about that life. I was never much of a horseman. I had my cowhands for that, but people said I had a good eye for the sort of cows that could be sold later for a profit. Sometimes I had to travel, however, as far as Sonora, Mexico, or Texas to find good stock. Thank heavens for the railroad. I would have been plenty saddle sore if I'd have brought all that stock back from Texas. When I was gone on purchasing trips, my wife Mary would run this house and the ranch as well, and a pretty good manager she was too. It was one thing less to worry about, that she could fill in so well for me when I was away. In good years, we raised barley on the ranch to sell in Port Wainimi, as well as fodder for the herd. But in dry years, we had to lease a ranch all the way up in Lone Pine just to raise alfalfa to feed the cows. It was hard living, but the weather in California was dry, and it was much better for my chest. I finally lost my dear Mary in 1925 after 46 years of marriage. I survived her by 3 years with the kind help of my loyal children. Then, in the spring of 1928, when I had just turned 75 years of age, I woke up one morning with what felt like a bad cold.
Robert Perkins Strathern died in 1928. He was buried in Ventura in the Ivy Lawn Cemetery.
Good morning. How are you? My name is Mary Gray Lamb Strathern, and I was born in Scotland in 1855 in a little town called Midlothian. My father, James Lamb, was born in 1819 and died in 1884 in California. My mother, Marion Strathern Lamb, was born in 1826, and she was in Scotland, but she died in 1899 here in California. My education was in Scotland. I grew up in and nearby the most beautiful and famous part of Scotland. That is the part that is called the Strathearn. The Erin is a river. There is a Loch Erin, and the Loch Erin becomes a river Erin, and Strathearn means valley of the river Erne. Now you know about Strathearn. And it's been famous since 80 AD, when the Roman general Agricola came there to subdue the Highland tribes. His son-in-law was the great Roman historian Tacitus. And so we have an accurate history of Agricola's campaign in Scotland, and later the Roman Emperor Severus arrived, and he brought roads, bridges, and civilization. There are many names associated with the Strathearn. It is a 46-mile long and 3-mile wide valley considered to be the most beautiful in all of Scotland. Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, Shakespeare's Macbeth, Sir Walter Scott all celebrated the Strathearn. During the time when my father was a young man, there were a series of lasting several years of great earthquakes in the Strathearn, and they were felt all across Scotland. They were even felt in Europe. Right now there's a big earthquake in Scotland too, called Brexit. My schooling was steeped in the ancient legends of the Strathearn and her storied beauty. As a young woman in the 1870s, I immigrated to California with my cousin and husband-to-be, Robert Perkins Strathern, and my future father-in-law, Robert Parr Strathern. Robert Parr Strathern was widowed when his wife Jessie Perkins died sometime after their son was born. I was 24 years old when I married Robert, and we lived in Carpinteria, where my first son, Robert Jr., was born in 1881. James followed in 83, while we lived in Peru. My husband cared for his orange groves and learned beekeeping from his father, who lived nearby in Bardsdale. Our home near Peru was called Buckhorn. My first daughter, Jessie, was born there in 1884. 2 years later, Marion came along. George, my third son, was born in 1888. I'm getting tired. Isabella, my third daughter, was born in 1890. My last child, David, was born when I was 40 years old at our new home in Simi. From 1884, when my father, mother, and 3 sisters immigrated to California from Scotland, I had the welcome help with my large family of my relatives not far away, except for my father, who died within weeks of arriving in California. It was a real comfort to me to have so much of my family near, as my husband was gone from 6 to 9 months of every year buying cattle from Mexico to Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Northern California. Our 14,000 acres in Simi was turned to cattle ranching, but we also grew barley and vegetables and raised farm stock. My husband's very good friend, Sequeda, helped him learn the cattle business. Sequeda bunked in the guest room in the Simi house often. That room was rarely idle. As business partners, my children's friends, my sisters, my mother, my father-in-law, and even priests traveling from the San Fernando mission to the Ventura mission would stay overnight in that room. There were always a great many mouths to feed and to house at the ranch. When the children married, Robert built a house nearby like the one at Middle Ranch near Moore Park. One of my great joys in Simi was my garden. I planted roses, flag lilies, oleander, violets, hollyhocks, olive trees. There was a shady bench that I sat in and enjoyed my garden. My home was filled with music and laughter when my children would play the instruments that they had learned in various music lessons. My son George was able to take opera singing lessons as a young man, and all the family sang while Jessie played the piano. My father-in-law was much drawn to hymn singing as a Christadelphian, but my husband was never one for religion. My granddaughter Frances was a big part of my daily routine when she was a wee lass. She hid behind my skirts just as my children had many years before when we lived in Peru. Frances described me as a lovely, cuddly type woman with only a slight Scots accent. After bearing 7 children and working hard to feed, house, and raise them while taking care of the ranch business and the many others who lived with us over the years, I began to be afflicted with ailments, gallstones, flu, poor eyesight, measles, neuralgia, and not too many years after my Davy came home from the Great War, at 67, I was ill with the dropsy.
Mary Grace Strathern died in 1925. She was also buried in Ivy Lawn Cemetery.
Hi, I am Robert Perkins Strathern Jr. I was born right up the road here in Carpinteria on June 23rd, 1881. I was the first of 7 children born to Robert Perkins Strathern Sr. and Mary Lamb, who we've already met. So as not to be confused with Dad, the senior, I was called Bert or Bertie by most of my acquaintances. However, to my family, they just called me Red. Most of my grade schooling was in Peru, California, where the original ranch was. When the folks bought the place here in Simi Valley, I stayed behind to help run the ranch in Peru, because back in those days we were expected to be responsible and independent at a very early age. Schools were scarce in those days, so I was packed off to Ventura, California for high school. So at the ripe old age of 15, I found myself living on my own almost a full day's travel from Mom and Dad. I finished there in 1897, and then I went on to Los Angeles for more school the following year. One thing you have to remember is that throughout all this time I worked on the ranch. There was not a lot of downtime. By 1904, I was working in the state legislature in Sacramento as a clerk. I decided to take some time off to pursue my passion for art. You have to remember that the legislature only met for a few weeks out of the year back in those days. It wasn't a full-time situation. As a result, I enrolled in the Hopkins Art Institute in San Francisco. And from there I went to Best Art School in Los Angeles. It was while I was working in the legislature that I started off with cartooning. It seems that art and politics were just made for each other. I guess I pretty much drove the rest of the family crazy because I was always doodling on something. This led me to always carrying a sketch pad and pencil on many of my trips, even when we were running cattle in the Owens Valley and other places here in California. These drawings and sketches became the basis for many of my paintings that you will discuss in a little bit. It was always a toss-up with me which I loved more, art or ranching. So I had to find a way to try and combine them. As a result of my love for art, I used to draw cartoons of political figures while I was clerking in the state legislature. That was during the term of Hiram Johnson. Very, very good subject matter. This led me to become a cartoonist for the Los Angeles Times for about a year. And then I took over the art department of the Los Angeles Express. You have to remember that this was a time before photographs were put in the newspapers, let alone color ones. I would draw cartoons or pen and ink drawings of sporting events as well as political events. I would cover the wrestling matches, the baseball games, or any other event that was in town, and I always had ringside seats, so I enjoyed that. I even went out on assignment for the Associated Press. I kept that up until 1911, when I quit and came back to the ranch. I didn't have a lot of time to do much painting until I retired in 1958 and moved to Ventura. I take a lot of pride in the fact that I never sold any of my paintings. I just donated them to various collections around the country. My work hangs in numerous private collections from here to Montana, including the collections of many celebrities, and appropriately enough, in the office of the Cattlemen's Association in San Francisco. If you folks take the time to walk around the park, and especially in this building here, you'll see many of my paintings on display. I guess you could say I never got ranching out of my system. As I said, I came back to the ranch in 1911. I guess I should be thankful for the ranching operation we had around the state, especially in the Owens Valley, because it was in Inyo County where I met my wife, Edith. We never had any children, but we had a wonderful marriage. We were married in 1917. I pride myself on being first and foremost a cattleman. I guess you could take that to mean cowboy. But beyond that, I was also a pretty good businessman. I was chairman of the board of directors of the First Western Bank of Moore Park for 40 years, and president of the Ventura Producers Credit Association for over 30 years. So I guess you could say I was a little bit more than just a cowboy. I loved the time I was growing up. I saw a lot of change. It was fascinating. When I was young, some of the fellows that worked on the ranch still wore six-shooters. I even broke up a gunfight once. I even remember seeing people ride their horses into saloons right up to the bar. It's that spirit of the Old West I've tried to capture in my paintings.
Robert B. Strathern Jr., Bert, died March 28, 1968. He was also buried in the family plot in the Ivy Lawn Cemetery in Ventura.
Good morning, I'm James Lamb Strathern. Lamb is my mother's maiden name. It's not a name that I would have chosen for myself, Lamb. I was born June 20th, 1883 in Peru. I was the second child born to the Strathern family, and the first one born in Peru. Dad leased land there, had orange groves, and ran some cattle up in Harper Canyon. In 1889, purchased the property here in Simi, and then in 1891, when the house was finished, we moved over here and moved into the house. I was kind of a sickly child, kind of like my dad. I had bronchitis, I believe, growing up, but by the time I was 10 years old, I'd kind of outgrown it. went to grammar school in Peru and here in Simi, and went to high school in Ventura and stayed in a boarding house there with my sister Jessie. The boys, we helped Dad around the farm here and ranch growing up, and when Dad told you to do something, you did it. One time he and I were in the barn, and he asked me to do a chore, and I said, why don't you do it yourself? And there was a Dutch door on the barn door there, and he took off after me, but I leaped through the Dutch door and got away from him. I was smart enough to stay away from him the rest of the day. As when David was born, that put 4 of us boys up in one bedroom up in the house here. So as when Bert and I got to be young teenagers, we moved out to the bunkhouse to sleep at night with the hired hands, and that was a education in itself. I learned how to chew tobacco and roll my own cigarettes. In the spare time, we kind of ran a little while, but we never got into serious trouble. When I was 12 years old, I heard a splashing noise outside the house and looked out there, and Davy, 2 years old, had fallen into the cistern. So I went out and pulled him out and kind of shook him, and he was okay. But you would think that, you know, after he became a successful owner of the Ford agency in Moore Park, that he would have given me a good deal on one of them new V8 flatheads, you know the kind that Bonnie and Clyde had, you know, but that didn't happen. When I started dating Roxy Richardson, Cecil Snively, there's another name for you, who lived across the road from us, went to the Richardson family and said that to stay away from them Strathern boys because they're a bunch of outlaws, but it didn't matter because she was smitten with me and I was smitten with her. So we married and moved to the Middle Ranch, which is now where Moore Park College is, and did farming there and did ranching and had cattle there. And for the most part, I stayed right around that area. Did travel to our ranch up in Lone Pine and also up in Chowchilla. And in 1910, I took a trip to Yellowstone. I was always concerned about the water supply, and I tried to form a metropolitan co-op between Thousand Oaks and Moore Park in Simi, but it never came to fruition. I was a trustee for the Board of Education in Moore Park from 1925 to 1940, and I continued to live in and around the ranch there at Moore Park for the rest of my life.
James Lamb Strathern died March 5th, 1969.
Good morning, folks. Sure is fine seeing all of you here at the home ranch. My name is Jessie Perkins Strathern. I was born in Peru on November 15, 1884, and I'm the third of 7 children born to Robert P. and Mary Lamb Strathern, and I was the first girl. I have 2 sisters, Marion and Isa. Of we 3 sisters, I was the only one that chose to marry. My middle name, Perkins, is the maiden name of my father's mother, my grandmother. I am one of 5 of my brothers and sisters born on the ranch in Peru, where we raised cattle and harvested citrus. My father purchased the Simi, also known as the home ranch, in 1889, but we lived on the ranch in Peru until 1891. I attended Simi Grammar School, which was located at 3rd and California Street, just across from the barber shop. I was quite the little letter writer and began corresponding with my Aunt Belle, my mother's sister in Santa Barbara, at the ripe old age of 10. And throughout my years, while living at home and while away at school, I continued staying close to my family and friends with my pen and paper. Because there is no higher education here in Simi, when I was 16, I lived at Webster's boarding house in Ventura and received my higher schooling there, along with my brother James and later my sister Marion. The railroad tracks were laid from Oxnard to Simi in July of 1890, thank goodness. So we were able to travel to and from school and home on a regular basis. I oftentimes rode the train to Santa Barbara to visit friends and relatives, many times staying overnight. I missed home and my family, so visiting made being away so much easier. While in Ventura, I was able to take piano lessons. In fact, I took 2 lessons per week to help perfect my playing ability. And my big brother Bert would often pick up sheet music for me to practice my playing skills. I'll play you a favorite of mine in a little bit. Along with a growing number of socials I was invited to while in Ventura area, and by the way, I always had fun. I attended a number of political gatherings and even heard Henry T. Gage speak. I did so love being a part of the political world. After completing my higher education in Ventura, I attended the Comrock School of Expression, a finishing school located in Los Angeles, where I also boarded out. In order to be able to continue piano lessons, I rented a piano for $4 per month. I tell you, it sure was crowded in that room when that piano was moved in, but it was so fun having a piano to play. I graduated from Comrock on June 11, 1907, and by then my sister Marion was also there. After graduating from Comrock, I returned to the Simi, where I helped my mother with cooking, sewing, and any other duties that went with running a ranch. My niece Frances, who lived at the Middle Ranch in Moore Park, and who was the daughter of my brother James, was also at the ranch a lot, but we were all took turns watching over her. I can still remember placing Frances up in the big, wide windows in the adobe so she wouldn't get stepped on while we were busy cooking or setting the table. Oh, what a joy it was to have Frances around. When Frances got bigger, she would crawl up into the big, wide adobe window all by herself and read for hours. What a good taste. My bedroom is the east bedroom upstairs, and my piano, as it was always known, is in the music room of the Victorian House. I met my husband, Hamish McDermott, who, by the way, goes by Mac, and we married on November 7th, 1917. We lived our married life in Castaic, where Mac worked as a land surveyor. We had one son, Robert, and he was known and called Bob Mac. When we would visit the home ranch, I do so fondly remember when we would gather around my piano, and Mac and my brother George would sing together, mostly not. But whatever, the melody was beautiful to all of us. Now, may I play you one of my favorites?
Jesse Perkins Strathern McDermott died June 7th, 1942.
Hello, my name is Marion Kane Strathern, and I was born March 29, 1886. My parents and older siblings lived in Peru at the time, and later moved to Simi in 1891. When I was 15, I lived in Ventura to attend school, like my older brothers and sister. I remember one particular time my friend Stella invited me to attend a May Day dance in Wainimi. I wrote to my mother to get permission to go. Also needed to ask if I could get new shoes because these shoes were too heavy to dance in. I pleaded with Mother to write back immediately and send it Tuesday morning so I'd be sure to get the answer in time. I will wear my blue dress if I can go, so please don't forget to write. Not living at home, I knew I had to ask permission. It was the proper thing to do. When I was 20 years old, I lived in Los Angeles, attending Cumnock School. I often went to the school activities. One Friday night, my sister Isa and I went to see She Stoops to Conquer, the senior activities play. It went very well. It was a fine play. And it was we all went to the party afterwards and had a great time, even Bert. I guess he might try to go again next time. He had a good time. I went shopping downtown to buy some lace. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. A dress was being made for me. I found some beautiful lace for 50 cents a yard, but that was too expensive, but it was too wide anyway. They did give me 25% off the 12 yards. That lace was 25 cents a yard. I sent the lace home to Mother the next day. I kept busy going to parties with Isa and friends. On Wednesday night, we went to the senior class play, then a recital on another night, and soon we're going to go to a recital in USC because we've never been to any activities there at USC. This business going out so much, I end up having to let things slide the next day or work doubly hard. I graduated from Cumnock School June 8, 1908. I was 22 years old. Cumnock was an all-girls school at the time. Soon after graduating, I entered nursing school. During my training for nursing school, the studying was not easy. It was not easy for me, and there was plenty of it. Mrs. Arbuckle considered anything under 90% a poor mark. I'm lucky if I was getting an 80%, and I thought that was good. Some of the doctor's lectures are simple enough and easy to remember, but then some of them are not. No matter where I was living, I always enjoyed coming back to Simi to attend the Simi Community Methodist Church music activities. You know, my whole family was involved in the music there. People would come from miles around to come and participate as well as to be in the audience. In 1919, I'm leisurely sitting on the front porch in Pasadena, where I'm living at the time, enjoying a great spring day and feeling so excited. I had just received word that I had passed the state board exam, and now I am a registered nurse. I was afraid to open that envelope for fear it said fail, but I did get 84%. It's not so wonderful, but it looks good to me. One of my fellow classmates called me up and said all of us had passed, so we were all as happy as I am. Later during my career, Max Hall, the man I worked for as a private nurse for his wife, was talking about farms one day, and I remarked that you could always tell an Easterner because they called everything farms. He said no, he had cultivated the habit because he was tired of hearing people speak of 3 or 4 acres as a ranch. He then asked how big our farm was. So I told him very casually, and he said, "Gee whiz." I thought it would hold him for a while. Guess he can't understand why he is, quote, giving away a good $35 a week. I'm not crazy about him, but I like his wife very much. $35 a week was my weekly salary as a private nurse. When I retired from my nursing career, I returned to the Strathearn family home in Simi Valley and lived there with my sister Isa to the end of our days.
Marion King Strathern died May 24th, 1968.
Howdy, folks. It's a real pleasure to be here today and share with you a little bit of our family's history. My name is George Strathern. I was born on August 26, 1888. I was the 5th child of Robert and Mary Strathern, right behind my sister Marion. Bert, the oldest, was 7 years my elder. I was born in Peru like the rest of the kids. Well, that is, except for Bert. He was born up there in Carpinteria, and of course Davy, the youngest, he was born right here in Ma and Pa's bedroom, right here on the ranch. We were a pretty wild bunch of kids, especially us boys back in those days. I was just shy of 4 years when we moved up here on the ranch, so I pretty much grew up here. When we first moved up here, there was no roof on the old adobe. Dad had to raise that. Well, I remember when I was young, we had a horse named Billy. We had a manger in the original adobe window on the north side. Over the years, we heard a lot of stories about that old adobe. We were told that priests used to stay here on their walking journeys back and forth between the Ventura and the San Fernando missions. And before the days of indoor plumbing, the upstairs bathroom was the boys' room. It was tight quarters and we made do. It was next to Ma and Pa's room. It was small, but for the most part there were only 3 boys in it at any one time. But we would roughhouse in there, and if I recall, we'd tear up about 1 bed a week. My mother was pretty tough. She got after us if we got too wild around here. I'll tell you, when I was a kid, we used to get up in the morning and we'd all come down that stairs, and one right behind the other. And going down the stairs, we'd all make that landing turn on the dead run, and we'd straddle that banister and slide on down until we hit the post. Oh, Mom used to give us hell for that one. Now, compared to the other kids, I wasn't much of a student, but I was able to muddle through. In fact, the first day I ever went to school, I didn't like it very much. So the next morning, I figured I just wouldn't go. I hid down by the old granary, and Mom came down there and got me, and she said, "You got to go to school." I said, "Well, I went yesterday." We used to walk from here to the Simi school, so Marion and Jesse, they grabbed hold of me, one on each side, and they took me up to school. And I ended up going there through the 8th grade. I had a lot of problems back in school. My first teacher was Mrs. Sherock. I'm left-handed, and to make things worse, or to make me write right-handed, she used to tie my left hand down to the desk. Pretty common practice back then. I also had Charlie Blackstock as a teacher a few times, and I'll tell you, I got into all kinds of trouble with the Charlie. I got some awful beatings from Mr. Blackstock. He went on to become a lawyer and a judge. And one time at school, me and Lee Cornett, we put a snake in someone's boot, and they found it, and they chased us boys all over the school with that snake. You see, all of us Strathers, we were a pretty devilish group, except we never raised much Kane around Dad. He didn't cut up like the rest of us with foolishness. I ended up going to USC for 1 year, and then I went to Southern California Business College. Now, most of you know that we were a real musical family. That singing and making music was as much part of the Strathearns as turkey on Thanksgiving. But what a lot of people don't realize is that I studied music for a long time. I got so I could sing pretty good back in those days. Truth is, I wanted to be an opera singer. I had a teacher in Los Angeles, and I used to go in about every 2 weeks and take a lesson. In fact, my teacher was an opera singer from the Chicago Grand Opera Company. I studied under him for 2 years or better, and I got so I could sing pretty good. And my good friend Mac McDermott, he was pretty good too. Him and I would sing together all the time, and my sister Jessie would play the piano for us. Back in those days, we all made our own fun. We played ball, we went on picnics. There was all sorts of people dropping in, and of course there was always the music. We all loved dancing a lot. They used to have a dance every year at the schoolhouse, and they called it the See Me Cowboy Dance. In those days, we'd dance all night. They'd also hold dances down at the old Creek Law building in Santa Susana. You see, we were a very close-knit family, and I don't recollect any of us getting married until we were at least 30. Now, in a lot of families, the kids were married off at 17 or 18, but our lives just sort of revolved around the family and, of course, the ranch. I don't know if you know this, but our original ranch was just a little under 15,000 acres, and my dad paid about $1.50 an acre for some of it and about $1 an acre for the rest. But in the end, I took to ranching like my dad. It was part of me, and it was in my blood. I love singing and dancing and playing baseball and having a good time. But ranching was who I was. I learned everything my dad knew about cattle and land and farming, and I knew that it was what I was meant to be doing. So I spent the rest of my life ranching. It was a fine life growing up here on the ranch and living here in Simi Valley all those years. Now, there was some speculation as to why I left the home ranch about 1930. But truth be told, Dad had passed away a couple of years before, and Mom a few years before that. We had ranches in Lompoc, Chowchilla, and one in Tehachapi. I worked all three of them. I was a rancher, pure and simple, and there was work that needed to be done. Oh, and by the way, I was the last surviving child of Robert and Mary. Thanks for stopping by.
Bert Strathern died December 6, 1975.
Greetings from the home ranch. I'm Isabella McKinley Strathern, known as Isa. I was named for my father's aunt, Isabella McKinley Strathern, who took care of him after his mother Jessie died. I was born November 6, 1890 at the family ranch in Peru. I am the sixth child of Robert and Mary Strathern and the youngest girl. My parents moved our family here to the home ranch shortly after I was born. Father had had a beautiful Victorian house built for us. Except for the few years that I was in school in Los Angeles, I lived my entire life on the home ranch. Like my namesake, I never married. My older sisters, Jessie and Marion, liked to call George and me the little ones. The little one's job was to look after our younger brother, Davy. George and I were very close and liked to play house under the old pepper tree. One day while we were playing house, we forgot all about Davy. He was playing contentedly near the porch, pouring dirt over himself. Marion tattled to Ma that we weren't watching Davy. So George and I got a scolding. We were told to take Dave with us and to watch him. I carried him over to where we were playing and placed him on a flat area near us. Davy proceeded to play happily in the dirt. It was a little later when George told me that our older brother Bert had earlier drawn a picture on that spot where I had sat Davy. Davy had already messed up the picture, and since Bert was always drawing pictures, I continued playing with George. Later, when Bert rode in to get ready for a potential cattle buyer, he immediately rode over to the spot where he had drawn his picture and saw Davy sitting on top of his picture and yelled my name, Isa! I took off running because Bert started chasing me on his horse. Luckily for me, Bert's horse Polly, who often with Bert chased after us kids, made sure that Bert never caught me. At dinner that day, Bert sat across from me and glared at me as I quietly fed Davy. I kept my head down so I didn't look at him. This is my memory book, A Short History of the Life of Isa Strathern. I was very fond of horses. My favorite memory was dressing up like a boy and following my older brothers around the ranch. I called myself Peter. Peter's first love was a calf. I went to school at CME School through 8th grade. In 1905, I followed George to Los Angeles to study at USC. It was a high school. While I was there, I lived with various combinations of my brothers and sisters. Around my 17th birthday in 1907, I received my class pin from USC. I was feeling pretty pleased with myself until one of my teachers, Professor Noels, told me if I didn't wear my glasses to class, not to come back to class. The day after my birthday in 1917, my sister Jessie got married. The same day in 1922, my brother Davy got married. After I graduated USC, I went back to live at the home ranch. I did some traveling throughout California, and I helped my mother with the cooking and the cleaning and the sewing. After my mother died, I naturally took care of the house and my father. Minnie moved home to help. My father moved into the downstairs bedroom. Eventually, Minnie moved into Mother and Father's bedroom, while I remained in the west bedroom. After Father died, I became the head of household for census purposes only. I joined the Methodist Church in 1925, where I was active in the choir and various groups. I was a member of the Simi Valley Women's Club. In the late 1950s, Minnie and I decided to remodel the kitchen to bring it into the 20th century and to make it easier for the two of us to move around. 1968 was a very hard year for my family. First, my older brother Bert died in March. Then in May, my beloved Minnie died. And a month later,
Isa McKinley Strathern died June 28, 1968.
I'm David Duncan Lamb Strathern. I was the only one of us kids that was born here on the home ranch in 1895, and I followed my brothers and sisters to school at Simi Elementary, which was about half a mile away at what we now call 3rd and California streets in the colony. I went with my brothers and sisters by foot and by horse. Now the school taught the 3 R's, of course, but for me it was all baseball. I started to play baseball as soon as I could handle a ball and a bat, and I played all the way through school. I represented the school, I represented the ranch, I represented anybody I could on a ball team. But then, by the 8th grade, that was the end of education in Simi Valley at that time. So my folks sent me down to Harvard Military in Los Angeles. Now that was not a hard place to get to when your father has negotiated with the Southern Pacific Railroad to create a flag stop whereby I simply had to stand with a flag, the train would stop, I would go to Los Angeles, transfer to the Venice red car, and get off at Venice and Western for Harvard Military. I stayed there till I was 16, and I played a lot more baseball. I also played football in the winter, basketball too. I was kind of a sports nut. Then, when my education was over, it was time to go to work for the family business. So the family sent me up to their holdings up in the Sierra. It was in the area of Lone Pine and Independence. Later on, it became designated U.S. Highway 395. And I stayed up there. I ran the cattle, I ran the horses, I ran the mules, I did the farming, the harvesting, and I played a lot of baseball again. I remember July 4th, 1914, a huge tournament. There was Tonopah, Goldfield, Bishop, and Independence, all day long. Baseball, 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 and then a big dance that night at Lone Pine. Along came the winds of war, 1917, and the Army put out a call for men all over that region, and I went to Bishop and enlisted in the Army. And so did dozens of other young fellows from that area of the state. And they looked at my records and saw that I had gone to military school. So right away, the first week, I became a corporal, and I took a draft of men from Bishop up to Fort Lewis, Washington, which was quite a train ride, through Reno, over the Sierra, up the Cascades to Fort Lewis, Washington. Once at Fort Lewis, I became part of the formation of the 91st Pine Tree Division. And it was better known as the Wild West Division because of all of us were from the Sierra, from the Cascades. We were a bunch of cowboys. We had 2,700 horses and mules. And there again, with my background, all of a sudden, I'm a sergeant. And I was assigned to the ammunition trains, and in those days, artillery and ammunition got to the front by wagon and horse and mule. So we trained until 1918, and then we went off to France in the AEF. And we got over there in July of 1918. And we fought in the Meuse-Argonne, St. Mihiel, and the Somme. And in years past, I learned that perhaps a young captain named Harry Truman was in the same sector in an artillery unit. I can't prove it, but I think I was over there with Harry someplace. When the war was over, in November of 1917, I stayed on in the Army of Occupation to take advantage of the ability to see a little bit of Europe, and especially to go to Scotland to visit the Strathearn family. And I did just that. I spent a lot of the month of February of 1919 in Scotland getting to know my aunts and uncles and cousins. Then I came back to the family business and rejoined the cattle, that's okay, the cattle and the horses, and it also became time to marry. I married a young ranching lady named Berenice Montgomery. We went on to have 5 boys, and they were Bob, David, Lloyd, Gordon, and Bruce. We began marriage here on the home ranch, but later we built our own house on the slopes of Mount McCoy. I remained very, very interested in civic affairs during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. I served on the Soil Conservation District. When the war clouds formed again in 1940, I served on the draft board, and by the end of the war, our little town of Simi Valley produced 300 draftees and enlisted men and women for the military, something this community was very, very proud of. I also had a Ford dealership for a short period of time in Moore Park, and of course the core business always was ranching. I also liked airplanes, and in 1968 I was down in Baja with my own plane, and I was on a little pleasure and a little cattle business, and I was with my sons Lloyd and Gordon.
David Duncan Lamb Strathern died in 1968 in a plane crash with 2 of his sons.
Well, thanks for listening to the Strathern family. And here they come. I hope you know them well now. And we're pretty musical, as Jesse already told you. And we sang a lot, and we'd like to sing again for you, and we'd like you to sing with us. I think you all know the name of
Home on the Range.
Discouraging word, and the stars are not cloudy all day.
Don't anybody move. I have to let you know you had two genuine Strathearns listening to all of this, and I hope you're at please. This is Gary.
No,
and
Mike.
This is no, wait.
Mike and Gary. Yeah.
That's Gary, and this is Mike. They are the twin sons of Dave and Janet Strathern.
Oh my God.
All right.
They said they probably learned some things they didn't know. I think they did.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, they're real.
Yeah, that's for real. Hope you enjoyed the performance. It repeats again at 2 if you have to
Well,
miss
thank you. My God.
part of it.
Hi, son.
Grandson.
Grandson.
Oh, okay, yeah.
More than one grandson, probably.
That's all right.
She did that on purpose, just so you know.
Kind of fun, huh?
Everybody's.
Can I get past?
Yeah, just walk by. Don't, just walk.